In this episode of The Business of E-commerce, I talk with Jacqueline Loffer, the founder of Reboot Girl. This is The Business of E-commerce, episode 12. Welcome to The Business of E-commerce, the podcast that helps e-commerce retailers start, launch, and grow their e-commerce business. I'm your host, Charles Pileski. I'm here today with Jacqueline Loffer. Jacqueline is the founder of Reboot Girl. Reboot Girl's mission is to help businesses on their e-commerce development projects ahead of project timelines, avoid mistakes, and save money. So hey, Jacqueline, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm great. How are you?
Doing good. Want to reach out and talk to you about e-commerce development projects. I found this an interesting subject a lot of people could be interested in.
So,
So yeah, just to get started, could you tell us a little bit about what you do at Rebuild Girl and kind of what type of projects you work on specifically?
sure. So, Rebuild Girl works with small, medium, and large size businesses, whether it's on their first e commerce site or their next e commerce site. I mainly work with fashion and beauty brands. That really has been the backbone of my work experience. So, that's really where my client base is. That being said, I'm completely open to working with, whether it's a B2B business or any other lifestyle brands or home decor.
And do you work mostly on the development side, or is it on the front end, or where do you kind of fit in on the?
Definitely on both sides. So I'm a project manager. That is like where my experience lies. So what I help them do is identify agencies, so on the design side and on the development side, and we see projects through to fruition. And I'll act as a project manager to make sure that everybody's getting along, have all the things that they need, and that they're getting the projects done on time.
Cool. Okay, so you have a lot of experience in actually, either the initial build out or kind of the upgrading or replatforming type of thing of e-commerce sites, right? That's kind of
Totally.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So then what are some things just kind of, so listeners can kind of get an understanding of what they should do when they're approaching a project like this. When you first start working with a client, what are some things you talk about? What are some things you try to get them thinking about to try to make the project go a little more smoothly?
I think it's really important to go through an extensive discovery period, really identify what the main objectives of making the e-commerce site are. So some brands, especially in fashion and beauty, they really want to make an immersive site that tells the brand story. So that type of site is definitely different in comparison to an e-commerce site that really is just purely focused on conversion. So identifying what your main objectives are, I think, is cornerstone to this process. Once you define that, stick to your guns and let that be your vision and your journey through the design process.
Okay. And what are some questions you would ask to try to get that out of them, to try to find, what they actually want to do there so they would understand?
I would basically ask them what their main objectives are, and
Okay.
is it, are they more interested in telling the brand story, or are they really just interested in conversion? Because it really that tells us so much from a design perspective and also from a platform perspective as well.
So certain platforms are better in kind of more on the, heavy conversion side and more kind of the branding design side?
Well, I think that there's some platforms that are a little bit more conducive to more innovative design than others.
Interesting.
And in some cases that there are some businesses where, they're really small and they're starting out, and maybe it's, they just need to work within templates in the beginning stages. Identifying that is really important.
Yeah, I definitely hear that all the time. People are starting to, pick a platform and they're deciding between even hosted versus self-hosted sort of thing, and, getting an idea of what their level of IT is behind the scenes. Where can they run like a Magento or something like that, or should they be on like a Shopify or a BigCommerce sort of hosted platform?
Exactly. I mean, if you're working with a startup, then I would definitely say, go with these hosted platforms like Shopify, or Squarespace is actually doing a really great job on e-commerce as well right now. So finding these smaller scale platforms and then scaling the business as it grows. So in the case of Shopify, obviously, if you start on their original platform, and then if you need to migrate to Shopify Plus, it makes it really easy to do that.
Yep. And what are some of the benefits of doing that? They have kind of an upper tier, right? Shopify Plus. What are some of the benefits of that?
Definitely just more customizations. You're not working with so many plugins. Excuse me. You just have a lot more customization from the checkout perspective as well.
Okay. So I just get this question all the time, so that's just why I ask. Any sort of platforms you recommend? Because everyone asks what platforms. I feel like when people are first getting started, that's the one of the common questions. Are you? Do you have any preference?
I definitely have my favorites, and I have the platforms that are not my favorites. Yeah. But I'm really impressed with Shopify. I'm really impressed with what Squarespace is doing, in particular for startups. So if you have any listeners that are in a startup and they don't have massive budgets, I think Squarespace is really worth looking into. Then I would also say that BigCommerce is impressive in my opinion. I think they're doing a really good job, and they have a really excellent team over there. And then, of course, Hybris and Demandware are always favorites too.
Yep. Is that anything on the hosted side?
That's a good question.
Or are you seeing less of that nowadays?
I try to avoid it for a lot of my clients.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like unless you have the infrastructure behind you, you need to know what you're doing to run a Magento, or even to a point of WooCommerce, right? Where,
totally. I try to veer clients away from WooCommerce at this point as well. Oh. I just feel like it's added costs, and it's unnecessary. So, and don't get me wrong. I mean, Magento, WooCommerce, these platforms are great, and there is a purpose for them, and there are clients that are perfect for those platforms. But I think that we're seeing less and less of it. E-commerce has been around for so long now, it's not this new thing anymore. So I think everybody's figuring out what best practices are and like the most economical ways to actually, run an e-commerce business.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of Magento, right? Versus one of the downfalls, where it's like infinitely customizable, but then it's infinitely customizable, right? So then, you can get a lot of weird things going on, and you can do a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of ways to shoot yourself in the foot. So
totally, 100%. And there's so many Magento developers out there too. So it can be challenging for clients. So
how do you recommend clients pick when they're deciding different agencies, different developers? What's kind of that process look like?
That's a great question. It's so much about this as relationships and also, referrals. So if, I work with agencies and freelancers that have really good rapport in terms of the projects that they've done in the past, the relationship that they have with the clients as well is so important. So I think it really comes down to, okay, what does that agency already have on their plate? What can you find out? Like, how many projects do they have running? What is the size of their development team? And making sure that you have the proper resources for your particular project to be able to make sure that it's going to get done and there's no stress on their side. And then, obviously just everybody getting along is so important in this process. If you don't trust the team that you've selected, you're going to have a really big problem. So if you go into the relationship being like, thinking that they're, trying to, nickel and dime you at every step of the way, it's just not going to be an enjoyable experience for anybody.
Yeah, that's definitely one of those. I got a start years back in consulting, and you have those clients you work with that you kind of they know your hourly rate, and they know, you're being fair and they're going to be fair, and it goes very well for everyone, versus you have the other kind of clients that have come in not through a referral, and they don't know you and they don't know your way of working, and that you're trustworthy. So definitely having that is huge.
Totally. Transparency is key, and just having, it should be easy to talk to that person.
Yep.
So, I mean, this is going to be your partner for the next, 3 to 5 years minimum, right? So, make sure that you feel comfortable with them. It's almost like selecting a therapist. Right?
Yeah. Well, and then making sure that's a good one, making sure they have enough bandwidth, right? Because, a lot of agencies or a lot of developers or, everyone will take on projects, but knowing they actually have the resources to complete it
Totally.
That's something, unless you've done it before, you don't realize that that's something important to think about.
Yeah, it's really important to ask like how big the development team is. I would also, one of the other things I think is really important too is talk to whoever the agency is or firm is, and ask them, are the people that are doing development also handling testing? I think it's really important for those two teams to be separate, because you want a fresh set of eyes looking at whatever was developed.
That's a good one. And then what sort of things on the actual like project management side do you kind of recommend? So there's not, scope creep and, any sort of like versioning on the project, where I've seen folks, on version 1 try to stuff everything in there. Then I've also seen, people go the other way where they try to have these very light, like small releases. They cut something and then flip to version 2 very quickly and start working on that. Any kind of best practices there? Or which side do you fall on?
Definitely. I'm a firm believer in discovery. So get everything written out exactly, like everything that everybody's wishes and wants from a requirement standpoint. Make sure that you really do your due diligence on like what systems are at play. So if you're selecting an e-commerce platform and your business already has an ERP, and you want to have an integration between those two systems, I highly recommend making sure that those two systems have had an integration before. Don't go into any of this blindly, and don't be the first person to do it. Yep. Unless you have like enterprise budgets. I'm a firm believer in not trying to reinvent the wheel, especially to help prevent scope creep. So just obviously lay out everything that you want, and then make sure you really understand what systems are at play. And then from there, you're able to have like a roadmap for your launch. And I think it's also important to say, and phasing, exactly like what you were just mentioning. Phase 1, we're going to do this, and then phase 2, we're going to do these other 10 items. And not feeling the pressure to be able to just have everything in one go. I don't think anybody should feel that pressure. Websites should be like decorating a home in a sense. Like you're always adding something new, and that entices your customers to come back or to stay.
I like that analogy. It always, I always think about it, some people, their first time around, approach it like remodeling the kitchen, right? Where you have the contractor come in, they build the kitchen, and then the contractor leaves, and, you enjoy the kitchen for the next 10 years, whatever it is. But it's not, but that kind of analogy of decorating, right? Where you're going to do it today, but it's going to be something that's going to grow over time, and it's not going to be, even 6 months from now, it's not going to be the same it is today.
Totally. Yeah, it's like refreshing the homepage.
Yep.
And I think the same should be applied from, features and functionality. There's so many cool things that are happening. So, maybe the goal is that you want to have a site similar to the Gap, where their product detail pages, not only contain images, but they also contain videos with like models walking and showing how the clothes fit. So maybe for phase 1, you just show the images, but then, in phase 2, you have video, and adding that feature and functionality is just, it's another thing to talk about, and another thing to talk about on, newsletters or social.
Yep. And do you recommend some sort of like maintenance budget after, so they do the first couple phases, they get it launched, and then they stick with this firm for, possibly indefinitely. Is that something people are doing, or is it some point where they kind of end the relationship and that's that?
I see it. I see it multiple ways. I think the best is, that you have a really great relationship with your agency or development team, and it's a maintenance contract that lasts, the next 3 to 5 years. In some cases, a lot of companies will end up, bringing teams in-house too, which I think is it's great, and once they have the team in-house, then, the development agency is only brought in for really large scale projects.
Yep. But having them kind of on hand and knowing that you kind of go back to the well and, they are there and, hopefully you're picking an agency that's going to be around and stand kind of the test of time. So when you need something 2 years from now, they'll still be there. They'll still be taking on new clients and you kind of go back to them.
Totally. And, I'm definitely going to say this, which is, I think that's the ultimate problem with like Magento and Magento developers is like so many times. I mean, the amount of times I've heard clients say, yeah, our site is on Magento, but our development team, it folded. And so the people that built the site, they're no longer available. So no one knows how the site was built. And so that's where a lot of these issues end up happening for these clients. They're like, we don't have anybody that knows this setup. And, then they have all these other developers come in there and like start modifying the code and like things start breaking and, that's where the problems occur.
Yeah, I've been on that in development projects where there's some bodies buried in the code and, you need that person there or someone there to tell you where the bodies are. And, you don't want your developers just uncovering them in production and realizing, oh, that's why that was that's why that code was, in that bizarre way right there. And kind of learning why it looked like that. And,
totally.
Not just making that change and then realizing later once it's in production.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
What are some common mistakes when people kind of approaching these projects you kind of see as, something to look for?
I'll go back to just really understanding the systems at play. I've been involved in some projects where, we have our project plan, but then all of a sudden there is a need for an integration between two systems which have never synced before. And I just, that's a big red flag for me.
Yep.
What else?
Would that be kind of a deal breaker, or would that be, what would you do in that case where, we seem to be the first people to doing this where, there's no record of this? Is that like, turn around and pack up, or is this, what would you do in that kind of case?
Well, in some cases, there are platforms out there that if they have never done the integration before, they just won't do it. They would put their foot down and say no. There are other platforms and other design development agencies that would say, yeah, let's give it a whirl and let's scope this out and make a rough estimate for how much this is going to cost, but there's no guarantee in that situation, So it really can be at the cost of the client. So if the client is faced with this situation, they really should decide if they're willing to go down that route and be willing to spend, much more money than what they originally expected to spend. And if they're willing to do it, great, go for it. Someone should try eventually with these systems, but I guess the question is, should you be the ones to do it?
Yep. Yeah, knowing that you're a e-commerce business and not a development shop, where as a dev shop you have an R&D budget to do these different things, but sometimes e-commerce businesses don't realize their objective here isn't to do R&D on e-commerce platforms; it's to build out an e-commerce platform.
Exactly. Yeah. Totally. That is the most articulate way of saying it.
Yeah, I've seen that one before, and knowing, here are the goalposts, here are kind of the boundaries, and, there's a couple things here that are unknowns, and this is where, we have some budget for them, but they could go awry, and knowing at least what those things are ahead of time is very smart, right? Where, just kind of moving down the road and finding out, halfway down, oh, this is a we budgeted X, but this is going to take 3 times that. We might not, we might not be prepared to spend that to finish this project. That's a scary
Yep,
thing to find out, halfway through the project.
totally. Yep, that is exactly why I think it's best to just not go down that route.
Yeah.
Another thing I would say too that I see as a big mistake when people are about to do, whether it's their new e-commerce site or a complete redesign and replatform, is on the client side. That is asking yourself if you have the team in place internally to be able to execute this.
Oh.
So I'm sure that you have many design development listeners out there, and they're probably always like, "Oh my gosh, we are working with a marketing department that has no idea what goes into a replatform," for instance.
Yep.
So it's a huge education process. It's a lot of setting expectations. It's a lot of training, from a content management side. So I would definitely talk to whoever leadership is, or if you're on the client side, really just identify your business and the people that are working there, and just make sure you have your team in place from an internal perspective that can help you see this project through.
So, and not just on the actual, picking the platform and getting the work done internally, but on who's going to manage the content, and going forward, who's going to be the actual boots on the ground helping to run the day-to-day with the new platform.
Totally. So when I was with Bliss, we had an internal call center at the company, but then we outsourced the call center. So when we redesigned and rebuilt our site, there was a whole training period of basically training our call center on how our platforms worked. So making sure everybody knew how to do a return and exchange, or apply free shipping if they needed to. So make sure you have a resource on the ground that's ready to train your team. And then the same thing for like your e-com or your marketing department that's actually working within these systems. I definitely encourage people to involve them in the early stages of selecting the platform. I mean, I realize that businesses are they make decisions based on budget requirements mainly. So once you determine what systems fall within your budgetary requirements, then once you've identified those systems, then involve those people that are going to be working with this in the system day to day, and just have them demo it and get their feedback. See if it works within their, day-to-day business operations. Like, is this going to improve processes for your team?
Yeah, I've been on projects on both sides of that, right, where they bring everyone on a little too early, and there's, a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and everyone's kind of weighing in on what they want. But then I've also seen projects go the other way where, they loop in the marketing department or customer service way after everything's picked, after everything's kind of cemented in place. And everyone goes, this isn't going to work, or what are we going to do? Or this is going to be a significant change for us. And it's going to, add all this kind of cost either in time or resources onto our kind of plate. And that wasn't accounted for early on. So you see that all the time in both extremes. So having that blend is pretty critical.
Yeah, I think if you select trusted people from each of your departments, and just say, hey, we really need to do this replatform. Here are the reasons, the business reasons why we're looking at doing this. And then you involve those people in this, demo view of whatever platforms you're considering, and get their feedback. I mean, this is your team. So
start with that small committee, and then kind of as you kind of drill down, grow it from there and involve more people. But start with a committee from a representative type of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, I think just having some select people from operations and marketing and
customer service. Yep.
Yeah, totally. And even finance too. You want to make sure your finance team has a chance to review what type of reports are going to come out of the system, and make sure that they have the needs that their needs are being met.
We see that all the time, where the finance team comes in later, way later in the game, and they're not able to get the data out of the platform that they need to actually figure out kind of the metrics of, are we making money, or, where is money being spent, that sort of thing, and actually kind of look at those metrics.
Totally.
And that's one of those things people aren't looking at up front, and they realize later, like, even the internal POs might not match the PO on the supplier side, and there's nothing lining them up. So then that becomes another huge project no one accounted for.
Yep. 100%. Don't forget about your poor finance team.
Yeah, they're in the corner, but they're very important.
They're so important. Yep. They definitely give them everything they need.
So actually, as far as finance, budget and timelines and kind of those hard metrics, how do you start figuring those out when, you're looking at, hey, maybe we should do this new project? How do you start even budgeting for it, or understanding, is this a 4-week project or a 4-year project, or what's that look like?
Sure. So again, it starts with the discovery period of just getting their wishes and wants, understanding also their current order volume and their site traffic, if it's already an existing site. And then once you've kind of identified, what tier they live in terms of a platform, the budgets start coming together. So, obviously, if it's a startup and they're using something like Shopify, it's going to be a lot smaller of a scale project. But then if you determine that you're working with a larger business that's like venturing into demandware, and they need integrations and so on and so forth, then obviously you're looking at much larger scale projects that are going to take longer.
Are you comfortable giving some ranges you've seen in form of budgets, or on the low end versus the extreme high?
Sure. Yeah. I have worked on projects that are $5,000, with one SKU, using a Squarespace site. Then I've seen projects that are, 1.5 million, that are with many integrations, and it's a complete redesign and a rebuild, and a lot of training is involved. Then I've seen custom developments also, in like the $250,000 range too. Obviously that was a few years back, and you see less of the custom builds, but, it really depends on what platform you're using and what you're trying to do in e-commerce. That is.
Is it kind of like a sweet spot where, for, let's say you said minimum 5,000, you're going to get like an off the shelf kind of template, most likely. You're going to get kind of everything off the shelf, but a little with your products loaded and that sort of thing, and a couple things loaded, but it's pretty much off the shelf. And then obviously you can go extreme in the other direction. Is there kind of a minimum recommended budget for someone venturing into this?
I think it really depends on the business side. Yep. And it depends on your business operations. It depends on what you have going on in the back end and what you need to be integrated. It's very tough to say.
Yeah. I know that's one of those things when you bring on new consultants, is always the first question of how much will this cost? And then you realize that there's a lot of work before you can even get to that first number. And part of that is the work. It's figuring out what the work will cost.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons why I created this business, is just so I can, work with the client. Like, that's a separate line item. I'm seen as like an extension of their team for, whether it's a 3-month to a 1.5-year long process. Right. And then, we determine what that ultimate cost is. But the end result is that, the full discovery has been done. Everybody knows what they're getting into, and they have a PM resource to see it through to fruition,
Well, it's probably nice they also, your cost and their cost are in 2 separate silos. So, what you're doing to run the project is a different cost than the actual project cost, and they don't depend on one another. So it makes you not have a horse in the race when kind of picking different vendors, and being on the side of the client and not the side of the developers or whatever firm they're choosing.
Totally. I'm 100% like the client's advocate.
Yep.
And whatever the design and development agency is that we select too, obviously they will be the advocate of the client too. But I'll be the person monitoring, making sure that, we're getting everything that was decided on and that we're doing it on time to the best of our ability, obviously.
Yeah, I've seen people either try to do that in-house with somebody that's kind of the first time managing the project. I've also seen people use the agency's kind of PM, and they both have their downsides, right? Where you're basically just borrowing someone from one of the other sides that's their thing, and there's not someone who just owns that one piece of the process, and you can see some issues with that creep up.
Yeah, totally. There's an interesting dynamic that happens too if it's a PM that's being used from the agency side and the PM is working for the client. I mean, I've seen it sometimes where like the PM on the agency side, it's like becomes the advocate for the client, and they feel torn between, keeping their actual company team members happy versus keeping the client happy. It's a weird situation to be in.
There's a weird dynamic where they have to make sure, the project's profitable, but also the client's happy. And they're constantly torn. So it puts you in a nice position where you can just focus on the client and, let the agency do their thing.
Exactly. And be that middle person for the agency too. Like, I mean, so many times poor agencies are like, but who do we ask?
Yeah.
Who is making sure that these designs are approved on March 1st, or else, we're never going to be able to get this site launched, Well,
that's the other thing. Who approves them either? Sometimes it's not even apparent. You can ask someone and they can say yes, but that's not actually the person that is ultimately in charge. So you need to even make sure, you're getting the approval from the right people at the right time so they can actually kind of move forward. And then having that in place so that they don't have to, sit around and say, okay, we're ready to go on March 1st, but, we're still waiting for these design approvals, and, that'll take another 2 weeks because Gary's on vacation. And
right.
Yeah. So I've seen that. I've seen those directions before.
Yeah. I really hate when Gary goes on vacation.
And he's the only one that can approve those designs.
Yeah, totally. He always leaves.
Anything with timeline that you can kind of weigh in on what people should be looking for there? And, should they be looking at, on the low end, is this like a few weeks, or, where can kind of things fall as a range, just kind of rules of thumb?
Yeah, totally. That's easier for me to explain versus budget, because it really, obviously time equals to budget ultimately, but I think at minimum you'll see e-commerce projects, with a decent SKU amount, not anything super crazy, but like the hundreds of SKUs. I think you could get those projects up in about 3 months. Then
is this for a new development or for like a rebuild, or does that not matter?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Like a redesign, rebuild. You can see it, in 3 months. No crazy customizations, obviously, no major integrations. And then, Bliss, for instance, our redesign and build it was a year and a half.
Yep.
So, but that was it was a complete redesign of the front end. It was a re-platform and then integrations to an ERP. We had a separate OMS too, so there was an integration from our CMS to our OMS, and then to our warehouse, and there was also a booking engine integration. So it was a very large-scale project. And
developing all that, and then the next phase of actually testing that and going back, and then, having some time to anything that comes out of those tests, work that again, and those are a lot more back and forth, I can imagine.
Yeah, it was a lot, and again, we had, I was working at Bliss at the time. So basically I was in charge of seeing this project through to fruition there. And so I had a dedicated team member from each department. And basically we sent orders, we placed orders manually on the site, and everybody just did their checks and balances across systems and made sure that they had, that all the data was validated, and that they were receiving everything that they needed to receive and able to operate functions the way they needed to operate them.
And that was a year and a half, you said, right?
Yeah, it was a 1.5-year project.
Would 3 months be an example of a very short project, or is there stuff you could kind of see getting done in, weeks? Or is that not even reasonable to expect?
I don't think that's reasonable to expect unless you have like one SKU. But I mean, you have the design process, and
Yep.
and you have the design process. Obviously you have the content management side of things. So if you're dealing with tons of SKUs, I mean, you have the product photography. There's things to do, and I think
There's a lot of housekeeping people don't realize too when you're kind of getting in there on, what's the About Us page look like? What's the return policy? All that kind of building out that type of content. Unless you already have that, like a rebuild, but if you have to do that all from scratch, that all takes time.
Totally. It 100% does. And I think 3 months is a good benchmark. Yeah, you could do it faster. Absolutely. If you have everything together and you're going to just go in there and have a friend design and build this for you real fast, I'm sure you could. But I think for the size of projects your listeners are talking about, I think minimum 3 months is reasonable.
Okay. That's helpful. It's a good rule of thumb. All right. Anything else you think before we wrap up, listeners should kind of know, or on the next project if they're doing something like this?
Nothing that I can think of right now. I feel like we really covered a lot, but feel free to reach out to me if anybody ever has any questions. So
yeah, if people want to reach out, where can they find you?
At rebuildgirl.com. So REBUILD girl, GIRL.com.
Excellent. And I'll add that in the show notes as well. So if anyone wants that, they can contact you and, start looking at the next project.
Thank you.
Awesome. It was great talking to you.
You too. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.